Croeso, good afternoon, welcome, thanks all of you to come. It's nice to see you all here in our afternoon about functional seizures. So great, so hopefully we've got some interesting things to show you and discuss this afternoon. Just a few things, the toilets are out that way if ever you need them. I don't think there should be a fire drill, so if there is, there will be a fire. Though it's so cold in here, I don't think any fires are going to stand. So apologies that it's so cold. We've tried to turn the air conditioning, but can't do it. Even tried to open the windows to leave the heat in, but that doesn't work either. But yeah, so thanks very much for coming. So we are being live streamed on YouTube as a reminder. And we might take some pictures. If anybody does not want to appear in pictures, please let me know and we'll make sure there won't be any pictures. Yeah, so two sessions, a morning session, a session before tea and coffee, a session afterwards, and we're going to talk a bit about our project. We're very lucky that Mahinda's come from London as well to give us a talk about an updated functional seizures research. So why are we here? Why are we doing this? A group of us came together, a group of clinicians, researchers, data scientists, and we realised really there is a real big gap in what we know about functional seizures and what the treatment that is available to people in Wales and the rest of the UK and the world, I think. And there was an opportunity in Swansea to use lots of the routinely collected health data that we have to try and learn something more about functional seizures. So that was the aim of the project. And we're coming to the end of the project now, so we'd like to discuss some of those results with you this afternoon, as well as talking about some of the exciting developments later on about the pathway, which we're obviously going to talk about, and changes in terms of the care for people with functional seizures and functional neurological disease in Wales. So better than me talk really, I'm going to show you a video now with some experiences of living with functional seizures, and maybe not all of you are familiar with functional seizures either, so a bit of an introduction to them. So to Hugh, well, thanks very much to Hugh, who's a tech guru and has got about 5 different adapters, screens up and doing all kinds of delivery, which is fantastic. And thanks very much to Bridget from FND Hope and also the team from FND Hope as well for putting this video together. We're very grateful. It's not a very long video, I think it's long enough, but even so you'll understand there's lots of work that goes into the video as well. So I'll get out of the way. In the next bit, maybe it's tension. Although functional seizures can often resemble epileptic seizures, they are not caused by the same electrical disturbances that we see in epilepsy.
I normally just sit down because I can feel it coming, and then my entire vision goes black.
So having the seizure felt like I could hear people talking around me, but I couldn't speak or move.
The nighttime ones are the worst because you wake up into one. And when it first happened, I didn't know what it was. paralysed, unable to speak. That's the most frightening thing of all.
So, yeah, I have fallen a couple of times because of it. She was there for one of them, and it was very scary.
We've found that the number of people living with functional seizures in Wales is increasing.
You can't communicate by touch or and use your voice, and you can't move, and you're in the dark.
Functional seizures are real and unpredictable and distressing. We've also found a small but significantly increased risk of death in people living with functional seizures compared with those without.
There's a lot of things about FND, and all of them are basically crap, but you can get through it.
But I think one of the key challenges really is the major gap in service provision and interventions that we have here in Wales. I've so often been struck by the distress caused to patients in just trying to navigate the healthcare system in terms of to get help. And often they feel forced to have to then use emergency services and A&E.
I tend to avoid them because they'll just go, you know what, you got FND, why are you here?
Understanding the diagnosis and having the right medical and psychological support can often make a significant difference, reduce seizure frequency and improve quality of life.
Totally changed my life, changed my personality, I suppose, in a way. It's taken, I feel a different person now.
I see the impact that that has on patients and their families.
I don't actually know the words. I don't think we've had a like.
So, sort of given the complexity of it, I think it's often very misunderstood, and that results in and that all concurrently impacts.
I wanted to know that patients with FND, the symptoms aren't just in the head. Like I got told to get up and walk one day, it's not that simple. But we tend to looked at differently by doctors.
I've literally had to figure everything out, every single step I've had to figure out myself, and then figure out how I'm going to support my child by myself.
What we know now with FND and functional dissociative seizures is that early diagnosis and early intervention does make a real difference in terms of outcome.
He took one look at me and went, right, where do we start? And we'll start with trying to get funding for rehab. Between both of us, we spent, I think, 2 months writing emails to different departments, trying to get help. So yeah, he's been quite amazing.
Was people qualified and read and able to be give us a centre where we could get specialist help, but there was no funding for it at the moment. And that was 5 years ago.
And the other thing that we want is better services for our patients. So at the moment, certainly in Wales, there's a real lack of dedicated services for patients with FND, and as a result, patients will tend to have difficulty navigating the health service.
Increasing that knowledge of different people in different areas that are put in place to help will make a big difference, because us out in the field won't feel so alone.
It would be nice for FND patients to be treated like non-FND patients, so then we are treated equally.
So while, in recent years we've taken some really great steps forward in terms of our understanding of the condition. We still have an awful lot to learn, and that's where studies such as this one undertaken by the Swansea team are invaluable.
You had it, or a member of your family had it. How would you?
As part of our work with the Welsh Neurological Conditions Network, we've developed a national optimal pathway for FND, which outlines what good FND services should look like in Wales. And we hope that the combination of these things will start to make a difference in raising the profile of FND and improving services and lives of our patients with FND.
I think it would be quite powerful stories, and some of us will have heard these themes, but they are recurring. And thanks so much to the people who've given their time and volunteered to share their experiences. Sometimes not very easy, so we're very appreciative of that. So we'll move on now, and we're very pleased to welcome Dr. Mahinda Yogarajah, who's a consultant neurologist and clinical academic in National Hospital for Neurology in London. And he's got a very wide range in research interest and specialises in seizures and functional seizures, and uses a variety of techniques to study functional seizures. So we're very much looking forward to hearing Mahinda now, and we're very grateful for him for especially on this World Cup day, and making the trip down to Swansea. So thanks very much for him.
No problem. That's, I guess none of us were expecting them to get to the semi-finals. So,
Wales are not in the semi-finals, are they?
so no, thank you for the invite. So,
we are getting word it's a little hard to hear the speaker, so project as much
yeah,
as you
yeah,
can
sure,
online.
absolutely.
Thank you.
This is the mic, is that?
Thank you.
If you stand by that.
Okay, can you hear me at the back of the room? Yes. And hopefully you can hear me online. Can you get any response online just to make sure they're getting it loud and clear?
I'll just check here. Well, a little bit of a delay, but I'll give you the thumbs up.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah. Okay, we're all good.
Yep.
Sorry.
Excellent. Okay. So no, thank you, Owen. Thank you for the invite. It's a real honour, a treat to learn more about the amazing stuff that's going on here. So the title that you gave me was "What are functional seizures and what causes them?" So I'm going to stick to that title, and that really, they are basically the aims of this talk, to explain what functional seizures are, and also hopefully shed some light on what causes them. But in doing that, I want to kind of address some of the myths, I think, that lead to conditions like functional seizures and FND having a whole lot of stigma associated with them, which I think your patients eloquently described earlier. So what are functional seizures? So what you're seeing on this slide, first of all, is the official position of the International League Against Epilepsy. So that's the kind of world's preeminent sort of epilepsy organisation of experts. And so the official term that clinicians should be using is functional or dissociative seizures. Many of you, particularly patients, would have come across other terms like psychogenic non-epileptic seizures, non-epileptic attacks, pseudo-seizures, hysterical seizures. Those are old-fashioned terms, and if you think about it, they're quite offensive terms, some of those terms, and they also don't tell you very much. Telling someone they have non-epileptic seizures tells them they don't have epilepsy, but beyond that, it tells you very little. So the official term is functional dissociative seizures, and then what you're seeing at the bottom of the slide there is the official definition of what a functional seizure is. And again, it's a bit of a mouthful. I'm not going to read the slide, you can see it up there, but essentially what it's saying is it's something that looks like an epileptic seizure but is not associated with abnormal brainwave activity that you would see in an epileptic seizure. That's essentially what it's saying. So again, it's kind of a negative kind of definition. It's saying it looks like an epileptic seizure, but it's not. Okay? So I would argue maybe this is a better definition, and this is a definition used in other papers where what they're trying to get at here is what might be the underlying mechanism or cause driving the seizure. And what they talk about are problems of voluntary control and perception despite the brain, the structure of the brain, looking normal on tests like MRI. So, what's the first myth? Well, the first myth amongst, I guess, I would say a lot of general medical doctors is that, this isn't a very common condition and it's harmless, right? So let's look at the evidence. So actually it's very common. So it's at least as common as multiple sclerosis, which most people would have heard of. And there's probably about 230,000 patients in the UK, particularly if you include patients with epilepsy and functional seizures. And if you come and sit in any epilepsy clinic, so I work at an epilepsy service in London, about 20 to 30% of those patients coming through that service will have functional seizures. So 1 in 3, that's a significant proportion of patients. So it's common, and it can be harmful. So to give you an example, there have been 2 large studies looking at the treatment of status epilepticus. So that is an epilepsy emergency where someone has a prolonged epileptic seizure that can lead to coma or death. And there have been 2 large studies looking at the treatment of that. People have subsequently gone back to those studies and looked at the raw data, and what they found was that 10% of the patients enrolled in those studies, and don't forget, to get enrolled in a study, there's an awful lot of boxes that need to be ticked by clinicians and doctors, but 10% of those patients did not have epileptic status. They had a prolonged functional seizure. Okay? 20% if you look at patients in their 20s, so 1 in 5. And those patients inevitably come to harm because they get drugs that will suppress their respiratory drive, suppress their cardiac function. Many of them end up on intensive care units, intubated and ventilated inappropriately. There are other studies which show, admittedly from single centres, that about 50% of patients coming to hospital with prolonged seizures have functional seizures. Okay? And so unsurprisingly, given the morbidity that I've just sort of mentioned to you, there's a significant healthcare cost associated with this condition, which is at least equivalent to that associated with epilepsy. Okay? And I also should point out that there are now studies suggesting that mortality rates are elevated in functional seizures, for reasons we don't fully understand, but they are elevated nonetheless. And fundamentally, these patients present to neurologists and are diagnosed by neurologists. So this is just an example of a table from a paper we published about 2 years ago now, where we attempted to break down the costs associated with a condition like functional seizures and FND. And it's just to give you an idea of, at a granular level where those costs arise. And what you can see from the data, particularly the range, you can see this is not normally distributed. This is going to be skewed data. But, if you end up in intensive care, intubated and ventilated for a prolonged period of time, that's going to be associated with a huge healthcare cost. And I'm emphasising this point because, if you're trying to develop a service, ultimately you have to show the managers that you're going to save money. Okay, so it's important to point this kind of stuff out. So let's look at the first myth. So this was, they're not uncommon, they're common, they're harmful, they're costly, but historically under-recognised and underserved. Hopefully that will change in Wales with the amazing work that you're doing here, but that's the reality of the situation. So the second myth that I think leads to a lot of stigma and prejudice is this idea that it's voluntary, it's deliberate, the patient is able to control this, okay? Now I could give you a whole talk on why that is absolute hogwash, basically. But instead, I'd recommend you read this paper. So this was published in Nature Reviews Neurology, so a serious journal. It's a detailed exposition of all the evidence, and we go through it all. We go through the historical data, the experimental data, the imaging data, and explicitly show how if you take those studies, take that data, you can show this is not voluntary, this is an involuntary problem or condition, okay? I'm not going to labour this point anymore. I'd say, if you want to dig down further, have a read of this, because it's all there in black and white. So, coming back to that second myth, involuntary condition associated with altered control, perception, and brain-body regulation. Okay? So let's come to the second sort of aim of the talk. Well, what causes functional seizures? this brings me to my third myth, which you will often hear from other clinicians who don't necessarily see these patients, and also funding bodies. When you're trying to get money to do research, they'll say, well, hold on, is this a real condition? Because they're so heterogeneous, these patients. They have so many different comorbid conditions, by which they typically are referring to psychiatric comorbidity. So I'd argue here, people are confusing two independent, although related issues, okay? They're confusing a why question, why does an individual develop a condition, with a how question, how does the individual end up on the floor having a seizure, okay? The why speaks to more sort of distal mechanisms, okay? It speaks to etiology, and there your biopsychosocial framework is useful. The how speaks to more proximal mechanisms. How is it that someone with a given risk factor profile ends up having a seizure? They're slightly different questions. They're related, but one, particularly the why, is associated with huge heterogeneity. I'd argue the how question is associated with less heterogeneity. And just to sort of illustrate that point, we don't do this with other disorders. So if you take stroke, for example, someone has a stroke, and you see them on a stroke ward, and you're explaining what's happened, you'll say, well, look, this is how the stroke has happened. A blood vessel has got blocked, or it's burst, and that's how the stroke's happened. Then the patient will say to you, well, why have I had a stroke? And then you'll talk to them about all the various risk factors that may be relevant, some of which are listed on this slide. And there are more risk factors, okay? So we don't do this with other conditions, but yet we conflate these questions with conditions like functional seizures, okay? This is just an example of the why and how people address that. So the idea of a sort of biopsychosocial model. I'm not going to go through it. Essentially, yes, there is heterogeneity when you're thinking about the why. The other point I'd make is, a lot of the time people assume that there has to have been a stressful event before the onset of functional seizures. So this is a really nice review. This is from the Lancet Psychiatry, so again, a top-tier journal, where they showed that if you compare patients with FND, so this is FND in general, not functional seizures alone, to other patients with neurological psychiatric conditions, yes, there's probably a 2 to 3 times elevated risk of some sort of stressful event before the onset of the disorder. But they also show that about a third of patients, 30%, there is no documented stressful life event prior to the onset of the condition. And in separate research and separate studies, yes, those papers do show their significant heterogeneity in terms of the existence of comorbid psychiatric disorders, typically anxiety and depression in many of these patients. But as I said, that doesn't tell you about the how, it tells you more about the why. So what about the how? How does the functional seizure happen? So traditionally and classically, people have focused on psychological models, and these are the 4 sort of most common models. So again, you can see there's less heterogeneity here than there is in the why. Briefly, the first sort of row there speaks to the idea that a functional seizure is a sort of activation of a dissociated material. So it's an activation of a sort of traumatic sensory motor memory or flashback. There's the idea that a functional seizure is a hardwired response. So it's the idea that it's a hardwired response to elevated physiological arousal. There's a Freudian idea that the seizure is a manifestation of emotional distress, which is the 3rd row you see there. And finally, the 4th row speaks to the idea that functional seizure is a kind of conditioned response. Okay? All of them have merit. They don't explain these seizures in every individual, but there is evidence for some, for them. But you can see there's no biology there. It's all psychology, which is fine. I think they're just 2 different sides of the same coin. So coming back to myth 3, yeah, there is heterogeneity, but typically in the why, typically in the etiology and the risk factor profile, there's less heterogeneity in the how, I would argue. So what about myth 4? I think, and again, I will see this in other doctors or when you're trying to get money to do research, people will say, well, this is a mental health disorder, there's no biology here, right? There's no neurobiology. That's the myth. But again, I think people are sort of conflating 2 kind of extreme positions. So the question you have to ask yourself is, can it not be both? And I would argue it's both. But then the question arises, well, when is a mental health disorder a brain disorder as well? Okay, and you have two polar opinions here. On the one hand, on the left-hand side there, some people will say to you, well, something that's a mental health disorder can't also be a brain disorder unless I can see something on an MRI or an EEG or some other test, right? Okay, but that's a flawed position. So I can say to you, migraine, which is probably the most common condition I see in a general neurology clinic, has nothing to see on an MRI or an EEG. But no one doubts biology there, okay? But then there's a polar opposite view, which some people will say, well, the brain is the mediator of all mental states, therefore everything is a brain disorder. But that's also flawed. So if you take something like grief, for example, yes, there may be some sort of brain sort of change in functioning, but probably more important than that are social and cultural factors, okay? So that's also a flawed position. So when can you call something a brain disorder as well as a mental health disorder? So lots of philosophers and scientists have thought about this, far cleverer than me, and what they've come up with is this. So you can call the two equivalent when you see reproducible differences on whatever test it is that you do. You can link those differences to symptoms or behaviour, but also crucially, thirdly, it all happens within a framework of accepted sort of understanding of neuroscience and biology. Okay? So if you've got a framework that's accepted, and you can show within that framework that there are reproducible differences, well, yes, then you can call something a brain disorder as well as a mental health disorder. So where do you begin? So this is what I'm particularly interested in, is exploring and understanding the biology, which is complementary to the psychology and psychiatry of functional seizures. So where do you start? Well, you start with the patient fundamentally. You talk to the patients, and if you talk to them, what you find by and large is that many patients with functional seizures, typically, particularly in the early stages, experience classical symptoms before the seizure itself takes hold. And those symptoms can be divided up into the two groups of symptoms you see here, such as autonomic symptoms, somatic symptoms, my heart's pounding, I'm sweaty, I'm tingly, I'm hot, I'm cold, I'm flushed, or dissociative symptoms, where they might say things like I'm disconnected, my body feels very strangely sort of light, floaty, or heavy, I feel spaced out, I feel dizzy. That's the kind of thing a patient would say. And what you'll see is if you ask those questions or look for those symptoms in patients with epileptic seizures and patients with functional seizures, just the presence of, say, 4 symptoms alone allows you to reliably distinguish between an epileptic and a functional seizure. Okay? This has been replicated, we've replicated it, other people have replicated it. This is an old study now, but a large sample, 200 plus patients with functional seizures, 100 plus with epileptic seizures. So what it all boils down to, essentially, if you're trying to sort of come at it from a sort of biological angle, is patients are either describing an absence of their sense of what people might call bodily self. So that's the dissociation, that's the I don't feel I'm present, I don't feel I'm entirely there. Or they're describing the opposite. It's almost like they're trapped in their body and they can't get out. So I'm just aware of all this stuff happening in my body, or a combination of the two. So if that's what the patient's experiencing before the seizure, where's the scientific framework that you can use to try and understand what's going on? Well, as it turns out, there is a wing or arm of neuroscience called embodiment neuroscience, which is grounded in this idea of interoception. So exteroception is the study of how your brain processes external signals, so sight, touch, sound, vision. Interoception is all about how your brain is constantly processing internal bodily signals, heart, lungs, bowels, bladder. Okay? That's important to make sure that your body is regulated physiologically, but people also realize it's important for emotion, it's important for cognition, and it's also important for this thing called a sense of self, the idea that you take for granted and is happening in a sort of subconscious, preconscious level, the idea that you experience the world from an embodied perspective, okay? That you're grounded, essentially. And we take that for granted until it goes wrong, which is when you start to experience strange symptoms. And so, again, I won't dwell on this too long, but essentially what people have found, what neuroscientists and philosophers have shown, is that this sense of self, right, that you take for granted but it's happening all the time in the background, is dependent on interoception that you can see at the bottom of the triangle there. So it's dependent on your brain's ability to process those bodily signals in a normal way, okay? turns out you can measure some of these bodily signals. Okay, so you can take an EEG and also put an ECG, a heart recording, on someone, and if you sort of analyse the two together, you can see a signal in the brain of how your heart is being mapped in your brain. It's called a heartbeat evoked response, which is what you're seeing in this slide. And what we did a few years ago now is we measured that signal in patients with epilepsy and patients with functional seizures. We measured it between their seizures and before their seizures. And what you see here is that, if you look at the graph here, is patients with functional seizures, that's between seizures, before seizures, it drops. Okay? That body to brain mapping is dialed down, whereas in epileptic seizures it stays the same. Okay? And so that's interesting, because it's telling you something about this body to brain mapping that is going wrong before a seizure, before a functional seizure, that doesn't happen before an epileptic seizure. We've replicated that, so this was published a few months ago, and we've extended it. So we can show that you see these changes in body to brain mapping that you don't see in epilepsy patients, but you can also see differences in this body to brain mapping which reflects the difference in the type of seizure. So some patients with functional seizures will convulse, there's lots of movement, some will freeze or faint, fall to the floor, unresponsive. And the way to think about it is a bit like a volume dial, this interoception sort of process. And at one point, if the volume dial is dialed up to the maximum, so if the interoceptive signal is going up, which is the white dot, you end up with a seizure where you don't move. Okay? Whereas if it's dialed down to a minimum, it's almost like the brain and the body are unplugged, you end up with a convulsive seizure. Okay? And that's what we've shown in this study, and this is just summarising that. So again, so seizure with convulsive activity, so the movement's increased, you see a reduction, volume dial down to 0, and you see a seizure where someone's shaking, but also you're seeing someone who's experiencing dissociative symptoms beforehand. So they're experiencing, I feel unplugged, disconnected, spaced out before the seizure. I'm telling you that HEP signal is dialed down to 0, and the seizure that tends to result is one with movement. Okay? Whereas you see the opposite in a seizure with no movement. So there, the volume dial is dialed up to a maximum. Patients will typically report sort of autonomic somatic symptoms, and the seizure that results is one with no movement. It's like a freeze response. So they can't move. So we've shown that's what happens, but you can take it a step further and try to understand, well, why is your brain doing this? So it's been reported in the literature previously, and also psychologists will tell you this, that sometimes in some patients having functional seizures, of course they feel tired, upset, embarrassed after they've had a seizure, but if you take the time to build up a therapeutic relationship, go through the seizure in detail with them, and then at the end ask them, okay, putting to one side the fact that you clearly and understandably feel tired and sore, but do you in a strange or odd way feel better? Many patients will say yes, they do. Okay? So the seizure is almost like a sort of a maladaptive regulatory mechanism that your brain uses at a subconscious, preconscious, involuntary level to deal with the abnormalities happening before the seizure. So here, if you ask patients this prospectively on a video telemetry unit, what you see is that you see this sort of sense of paradoxical relief after a seizure in 70% of patients with functional seizures, 15% of patients with epileptic seizures. So it's diagnostically useful, but it's also telling you something useful mechanistically, because this is a mediation analysis. What it's saying is basically the patients with high levels of dissociation beforehand are much more likely to experience the sense of relief afterwards. But it gets even more interesting when you kind of explore the lived experience with patients. You know, what is it you're experiencing? And it's classically things like this. It isn't, I feel less anxious. It isn't, I feel less stressed. It's none of that. Patients will describe things like this. They'll describe, for example, feeling clearer in their head. They'll describe feeling less fatigued, more energized, feeling whole again. So the seizure is essentially a regulatory mechanism that the brain is using at an involuntary level to deal with that volume dial that's either too high or too low before the seizure. Okay? And this is summarizing how I would think about things biologically. And just to emphasize, I mean, it's gibberish, isn't it? But essentially what I'm saying here is the seizure is a response to that change in body-to-brain mapping that occurs before the seizure and manifests with all sorts of symptoms if you take the time to talk to the patient. Okay? Either dissociative, either unplugged, or either just trapped. So much going on in their body, overwhelming. Okay? So coming back to myth 4, so there is reproducible neurobiology. I've just shown you studies, and there are other groups that have shown similar things with the hair. So it's reproducible. I haven't pulled this out of thin air. This is within an accepted neuroscientific framework, which is the science of embodiment or interoceptive neuroscience. And the other point to make is everything I've just shown you is completely in keeping with psychological and psychiatric models. So it's not an either-or game. It's just saying there are two sides to this. There are two sides, two ways of looking at things. And if you take a more broad view of things, you open yourselves up to maybe different types of treatment, better methods of diagnosis. It makes for, perhaps I would hope, a better way of helping patients. Okay? And what I've shown you is that the biology involves brain-body systems that are important for attention, arousal, and bodily self-awareness. So what does this mean for a pathway? Because that's why everyone's here today. So I think it means that, a diagnosis needs to be early, as I think Owen said earlier, positive and clearly explained. Patients need early validation. The seizures are real, they're involuntary, but it's very, very common even though no one talks about it. And it's treatable, most importantly. There needs to be emergency care plans to prevent unnecessary admissions and unnecessary sort of iatrogenic harm. And care needs to be joined up, it needs to be integrated, right? You need neurologists, but you also need psychological services and psychiatrists in some patients. Okay? You need all of the above, not either or. And treatment, based on the biology that I've shown you, should develop, I think, in the future to think about things like bodily awareness, arousal, regulation, attention, as well as avoidance and comorbidities. Not just stress, okay, which is the kind of oversimplification, I think, that many people would sort of conclude functional seizures are. So in conclusion, real common, disabling, involuntary and costly, okay? That's what functional seizures are. There is heterogeneity, but I think, as I said to you, people confuse etiology with mechanisms. Okay? Yes, there's heterogeneity where the why question is concerned. Why has someone developed this? But in terms of how does someone end up on the floor having a seizure, I think there's less heterogeneity. Okay? There is emerging biology. I've shown you some biology. There are other studies out there that I could have shown you, but essentially there is neurobiology here which points to altered brain-body signaling, attention and embodiment. And a good pathway hopefully would turn this kind of explanatory material into earlier diagnosis, less stigma, and ultimately better, more joined up, coherent care. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mahinda. That was a really nice, clear talk, and I'm sure there'll be lots of really useful information and messages there. I think we're going to take some questions at the end, but we could probably take one or two questions if anyone's got any further questions. Yeah, hi.
I have a question about when you talk about functional seizures and they're not, you have like an epileptic state, but you can also have changes in behaviour. And when you, my daughter particularly had aggressive seizures. She had functional seizures for a number of months. Yeah. But then she had all of the seizures, all of the different types. But then they became regressive, so she regressed to 6 years old. So there's not much talk there about changes in behaviour. Yeah. It's just based on the epilepsy model.
Yeah, so absolutely, and I would say everything I've shown you is an oversimplification. So absolutely, this is not. I mean, hopefully, I didn't give you the impression it's a simple sort of diagnosis. It isn't. It's complicated, absolutely, and there can be significant variability in the way people present. I guess for me, when I'm trying to focus on, how do I try and understand the biology, because I'm not a psychiatrist, a psychologist, you kind of have to oversimplify to get to a starting point, basically. And so what I've shown you, absolutely, it's a baseline, exactly. Yeah. It's not going to explain everything and everyone, far from it, but it's a baseline, and then hopefully the idea is that with time we can sort of add to that and also make it sort of more unique to the individual patient that you have.
Yeah,
in front of you. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Rob, you have a question?
Thanks, Mahinda. That's really interesting talk. There is really complicated concepts, aren't they, to get across, even when you're talking to other neurologists. I know when you talk to people who maybe haven't got a scientific background. Do you have a sort of set of phrases or words that you use when you explain it?
Yeah, so we've developed our own information sheets off the back of this and made it, piloted it with patients and things. So the kinds of things, the concepts I find useful, and I think certainly in my experience patients can access, is first of all that there is biology here, and I'm not suggesting this is all because you're stressed and you don't know it, which is often the experience of many patients in A&E or other sort of with other medics. So I'll go through the how and the why, and I'll explain, look, there's lots of reasons why you might have developed this, and in the same way if someone goes to A&E with a heart attack and they're smoking 100 a day, if I unblock the artery but you're still smoking 100 a day when I discharge you, you're just going to come back in with another heart attack. So you have to look at the whole picture, okay? So that's how, so I'll use the why and the how in that way. And then in terms of the how mechanism, I will basically use the kind of analogy I was using, which is that the brain sits in the skull, it's wired to your body, it's constantly receiving information from your body 24/7, you're not always aware of it, sometimes you are when you feel hungry, thirsty for example. And normally your brain is controlling the volume of that information, okay? And it's carefully calibrated, carefully controlled. And the problem with functional seizures is it gets broken, and sometimes it's dialed up, and then I might relate that to the symptoms they've told me about, which is the sort of somatic autonomic symptoms, and sometimes it's dialed down to zero, so that's literally your brain and body unplugged, and that's the kind of strange stuff you found hard to describe to me, the feeling spaced out, feeling disconnected. And then I'll say the seizure is essentially like a fuse being tripped, so it's a reflex in a way to deal with those symptoms, to manage that, to reboot the whole system, which is why, in some patients, not all, but in some, there is this kind of strange feeling of, better in those ways than the patients described after the seizure, because it's a reboot mechanism, it's a reset mechanism. So that's the kind of framework I would use.
Yeah, thanks very much. Some really clear messages there. I think we need to move on. There'll be a chance at the end for some more questions, and also for some online questions, and also during our break we have a little break of 2:30 as well. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Beata Fonferko-Shadrach. A warm welcome to Beata. We're lucky to have Beata working as a researcher with us in the group in Swansea. And Beata's very talented. She speaks at least 4 languages, or 4.5 you said earlier, 3.5, and has background in public health, very good with data, exceptionally good with data. So Beata's going to talk briefly to us now about how we find people in anonymised data. So in our project we've used data that we collect every day, but it has to be anonymised so that we can use it for research. And then you say, well, how can we identify people who've had functional seizures in the data? So hopefully Beata will be able to explain this a bit. I'll hand over to you.
So I'm going to talk about the way we identified people with functional dissociative seizures within routinely collected data. So it's a validation part of our research project. So I mentioned SAIL in the title, but SAIL, it's a secure anonymized information linkage data bank, and it holds billions of person-based anonymized records relating to administrative records and health records. And for studies such as this, that we're trying to identify people with a condition, the best source, or the first source that we would use would be primary care records, and SAIL covers about 86% of population in Wales, so it's 83% of practices, and hospital records. So we only have admissions, but they cover all of Wales population, whether treated in Wales or outside. And what's wonderful about SAIL is that it provides secure research environments, so where records can be linked with other sources, so GP records, hospital records, census, and disease registers. So how do we find out people with FDS in these records? For every GP encounter, so it's when patient reports their symptoms, then diagnosis, treatments, referrals are coded with read codes, and that's Mr. James Reed, and all the hospital records, so it's only inpatient episodes, are coded on discharge with ICD-10. So it's not just primary diagnosis, you have secondary diagnosis and also some subsidiary diagnosis, so up to, I think, 20. So you would think they would be simple just to find the codes and you just run them and you find the people, but unfortunately not. And what the Mahinda said, actually the condition is confusing, it's not very well recorded, there is no simple code, it's sometimes based on symptoms and which overlap with other conditions, and also it's very often misdiagnosed, not just as epilepsy. So in these cases we have this well-tested approach, that we have a cohort of people, so the purpose circle, it's a cohort of people that we know definitely have a condition, the disease, and then cohort of people that we know that do not have a condition. We have some candidate codes that we put into an algorithm, and then we check, we run these algorithms on GP records using read codes, and then on hospital records using ICD-10, and then we check how many people from our cohorts that definitely have the condition and they don't are actually are sort of present in those two sets. Ideally, you arrive at something like this. So you have your GP records and you manage to identify everybody from people who have the condition, and same for hospital, but people without the disease would stay well out. But that's ideal result. More likely, you'll get people who are confirmed to have the disease, and we just identify some of them, but you also, unfortunately, get people who do not have the condition, so you really don't want to have them there. So what do we do then? We sort of experiment with codes. First of all, we have to have a group of people with FDS. So what we've done, we identified people in a sort of register from neurology centres in Swansea, Cardiff and Newport. So we had a group of people that definitely had FDS, and we had some sort of basic clinical information about them. But additionally, we had people who were identified by the NLP pipelines, it's natural language processing pipeline, that we developed to capture clinical information about epilepsy from neurology clinic letters. But as part of patient history, it also captures functional seizures. So this is just a brief look at the pipeline. So you can see the typical letter. This is a synthetic letter. And on the right-hand side, you have the epilepsy output. So things like diagnosis, and it picks it up from the letter at the top and gives it a certainty level, which is there to, it's an expression of confidence with which the statement of diagnosis is made. So for patient history, we identified a number of things, but with the first one, it's associative seizures, and they are, oh, sorry, I can't see this.
Yeah, no, don't forget.
So the associative seizures with certainty level of 5, and then lower down it's less certain, and then at the bottom it's actually not that certain. And what we do, the certainty levels are from 1 to 5, and 1 it's not likely and 5 is definite. So for our cohort, we had individuals that were already identified by clinicians, but with the exact output, we selected those who had 2 letters and annotations of certainty of 4 and 5. And in addition to this, use exact to identify people without FDS. So this was our group without the condition. So again, there were individuals identified with from the letters by patient history annotations, and so they had something else, but they did not have epilepsy, they did not have FDS or any other non-specific seizures, so or blank episodes or whatever it sort of said in patient history. And what we do, or what we did, we use this sort of standard approach that you have personal data, it's uploaded separately from clinical data, and it's securely sort of sent to SAIL data bank, and it's encrypted, so it's all anonymized, and then it can be linked with other data sets in SAIL. And once in SAIL, we have these candidate codes. So we had a number of sets for GP data, and we ran this within our algorithm on all GP records in SAIL, identifying people who had the condition. And then we checked how many people from our cohorts with FDS and without FDS were captured among this group. And we did the same with hospital records. So we had different sets of codes, we put them in the algorithm, and then we ran it on all inpatient records, so this sort of discharges codes using ICD-10. And again, we then checked how many people from our two groups with FDS and without FDS were captured in this set, by these sets. And also, and I'll show you later why, we sort of experimented with joining some of the sets to improve our results. So the standard approach, once you sort of have the results, you have to analyze them. So what we do, we had on the left, you can see the people who definitely have the diagnosis of FDS and who don't. So these are our two groups. And then you measure things like with values like true positives, so the people who definitely have the diagnosis and we manage to capture them. Then you have the people who do not have the diagnosis but we still capture them. And then the false negatives are the people who have the diagnosis but we miss them. And then true negatives are the people who do not have the diagnosis and we didn't capture them, so that's fine. And on basis of these, we can do this sort of final ways of comparing the results. It's sensitivity, which sort of tells us how well we identified people, how sensitive our algorithm is. Specificity, it's how well we actually performed in not identifying people who do not have the condition. And finally, sort of single result, which is really good, outcome, it's positive predictive values, it's precision, and it actually tells us how good the algorithm is overall. So that's like a single measure. And so how did we do? So in general, all our algorithms were very specific, so we didn't have that many false positives, but they were not very sensitive. So even with the best ones, and I put in the table the best and the worst from the different sets, and you can see that we hit 40% for GP when we put the three together, and for hospitals it's only 20. So, and there were some, which actually, somebody mentioned post-traumatic stress disorder, that's code that was being used by GPs, but there's so many false positives with this. Obviously, it's used instead of FDS. And then just to visualize it better, so this is our GP set with 40% sensitivity when we did our sort of three sets together. And you can see we sort of captured people with FDS, but not completely. But we had only a few false positives. And then with hospital, we actually didn't have any false positives, but we also didn't catch many. So we improved our performance when we actually put the sets together. And we ran them as one, with sensitivity went to up 48% and positive predictive values to 98. So it's actually good, but it's not very good. So sort of final thoughts on this, that we had the algorithm, we had the group of people who definitely have the condition, and we created an algorithm which would validate it on SAIL data, and it performed relatively well, considering the condition is not recorded. So we can see from GP records that we do not pick up people with FDS because they are just not in the records or they are misdiagnosed. For hospitals, well, it's not a brilliant source because people have to be admitted to have the diagnosis. But most importantly, I think that we know that the algorithm that we created, it's effective, and you can be confident that actually the people then who we pick up in all of SAIL population, so when we apply it to the whole population of Wales, we'll pick almost 50% of people with the diagnosis of FDS. So I think it's successful. So this is the team. Thank you very much, and thanks for the questions.
Great, thanks Beata. So lots of complicated stuff there. Beata's done lots of hard work behind the scenes. But basically, so from this stage now, we could identify people in this routinely collected data. And as Beata said, when we do see someone in the data, we're pretty sure that they have functional seizures as diagnosed by a neurologist. The issue is that what we found is about half the people with functional seizures didn't get an accurate code put in the GP data, hospital data. And I think that's something we sort of know. The people with epilepsy, for example, as a comparator, or, you know, the figures nearer 90%, but with functional seizures, it's 50%. So this was the sort of framework really to move forward and now look at functional seizures in Wales. Any what type of one question for the actor, or you can answer at the end?
We've got a couple of questions online,
okay.
So when would you like to take them?
We could take one online and one in person now, and then we'll do some more at the end. Yeah, great.
Absolutely. So we've got a gentleman. I assume it's a gentleman. We've got a person. Tyson_philosophy asks if functional seizures can give relief after being through them, could they be like crying that helps release stress and down-regulate the nervous system?
I think that's a question for Mahinda.
Yeah, so they can down-regulate things. Yeah, absolutely. So sort of, it's a. I guess you could think of it as an involuntary regulatory mechanism, reflex. Reflex is the way I think about it. Yeah.
And Mahinda, you had a question yourself.
Yeah, so I was just wondering why you thought it's not documented, coded properly. Do you think that's stigma? Do you think that's
I think
people
so.
afraid to sort of call it out, say this is what's going on?
Yeah, I think, you know, even I've noticed my own practice, if I clearly would put the diagnosis at the top of the letter, doesn't end up as always as a code. And I think sometimes there's an issue with things that are misdiagnosed as epilepsy first, and people are very wary about swapping diagnoses, so that's another thing. I think part of it is not enough awareness of things.
And terminology, not being aware of which terminology.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Confusing terminology, a lot changing over the years.
Yeah, people just put seizures down and just leave it as that.
Yeah.
But with the post-traumatic stress disorder, I think I looked at the numbers, and it does look as if this was the code used instead.
Yeah.
But then because we also captured so many people without MDS with this code, well, we can't use it.
Yeah.
But there were these two codes, and that was similar one in hospitals. So on one of the slides, again, captured quite a few, but also there were many false positives.
Yeah. So that, you know, so that's one of the first learning points really, is that, you know, we need to code things better, don't we? Yeah.
I think doctors are just less confident about making the diagnosis, and with the lack of a diagnostic test means that doctors are more likely to sit on the fence about this than other conditions, especially if you're not used to seeing a lot of it. So they're likely to label it as something else or not give it a name until they're sure.
And then what do we do with that person?
Yeah.
Where do they go?
Yeah.
Definitely, you know, that's one of the results we certainly need to work on. Perhaps there's a bit of evidence that we're getting a bit better that recently than maybe 10 or 15 years ago. But, okay, so we'll move on now and ask Dr. Russell Kahn to come and talk to us. So Russell's going to talk to us about some of the results from our study, building on what Beata described. Dr. Russell Kahn, he's a researcher again with us in Swansea. And we're lucky, Russell did his first degree and PhD in geology, so I can literally say he's done a seismic shift in healthcare data research, and we're very lucky that he's come to work in the healthcare data field. So I'll hand over to Russell now to present some results.
Thank you very much, Owen. Yeah, as I said, I'm Russell, one of the lead researchers on this project alongside Hugh and Beata, and I'm going to talk about the main project results that we've got so far. So I'll probably mostly skip this first slide because you all know the study population in Wales and we use the SAIL data bank. I'll briefly mention we managed to link in data from the 2011 and 2021 census, which should give us deprivation at a household level and employment, which should be useful to see. So we applied the best performing algorithm from Beata's work to all of the GP and hospital data in SAIL, which is sort of shown on the flow diagram on the right. I'm going to simplify that and just say we identified around 4,000 potential cases, so people with a GP or hospital code in their records that and they might have functional seizures, but when we limited that down to our study window, which was 2003 to 2023, and removed people with missing data, we ended up with 2,800 people with functional seizures in Wales for that period. And just some context, this is probably the first population level study of functional seizures in any country, and I've put some recent studies on here. So even though we only had a sensitivity of 50%, so we're only finding around half of the people who we believed have functional seizures in Wales, we've still got around 3 times as many cases as the next closest study. So this should really give us a bigger picture than we've ever had before. We kind of did the same approach, but with epilepsy cases, and I'll just quickly say we identified 43,000 people with epilepsy within that same time window in Wales. So onto the epidemiology of functional seizures. How many people are being diagnosed with them in Wales each year, and how many people do we estimate are living with functional seizures in Wales? So this first graph at the top here, panel A, shows the incidence, so the number of new cases each year. So we estimated the value for male and females to be around 9 cases per 100,000 people. So compared to some recent studies, this is at least 3 times as many cases as these other studies have found. But like I said, these weren't population studies before. They're often just single centre studies or only a few centres in a country. And we can also see, I'd say, from around 2011 onwards that there's been an increase in the number of diagnoses each year, which, since we just talked about, it could be that there's better coding going on. We can't really tell at this point. The GPs might be reporting the condition better. In terms of the prevalence, the number of people living in Wales with this condition annually, in 2023, I think it was, we estimated 90 cases per 100,000 people. This is higher than one of the other study which estimated prevalence, and similar to another one, but just for some context here then, compared to another neurological condition, so multiple sclerosis, the most recent study I could find in the UK, I think Mahinda had a more recent one on his slides, but they estimated an incidence of 9.6 cases per 100,000 people, which is the same as our 2023 incidence, and a higher prevalence, about double, but like I said, we're only finding 50% of functional seizure cases, so our prevalence is likely a minimum estimate and could be almost twice as high. Okay, so on to the cohorts that we sort of used for this study then. First of all, for every 3 people we identified with functional seizures, I said that was about 2,800, we found 3 people who definitely did not have functional seizures or epilepsy, so we call them our non-seizure controls, so there are 8,500 of them. We then had the 2,800 people who had functional seizures, which we split into people with functional seizures only, so about 2,000 people, and then 800 people who we found to also have epilepsy, so about 30% of people with functional seizures also had epilepsy. And then we created an epilepsy control group. So although I said we identified 44,000 people in Wales in the study period with epilepsy, if you use the all Wales epilepsy population, that population was around 10 years older on average than the people with functional seizures, so it wouldn't really be fair to compare outcomes and sort of mortality in this group because of their older age. So we did the same thing. We did a 3-to-1 match. People, for every one person with functional seizures, we found 3 people who had epilepsy, and I should have said the controls as well. These people were matched based on their week of birth, their gender, and their area-based level of deprivation. So 75% of our cases were female, which is what a lot of studies find, the sort of ratio of male to female with this disorder. The mean diagnosis age was 37 years. It was slightly younger for our epilepsy controls. Like I said, we matched by week of birth, not based on age of diagnosis. The mean death age across the study period for the cohorts was 77 years for our control group, 69 years for the functional seizures only group, 59 years for people with both conditions, and 61 years for the epilepsy cohort. If we look at comorbidities, common mental disorders, so anxiety and depression defined here, whether people have been prescribed an antipsychotic at any point in the study period, whether there's records of severe mental illness, so schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, and whether they were a frequent attendee at any point in the study period to emergency departments. So we define a frequent attendee as someone who attended A&E 5 or more times in a single year. And if you look across these 4 sort of variables, we can see in functional seizure cohorts much higher, a lot more than double rates of common mental disorders, around 6 times as much many people being prescribed antipsychotics, 10 times the rate of mental illness compared to the controls, and 10 times as many people being a frequent attendee to emergency departments. For the people with both conditions, we can see things are similar but maybe slightly higher in all instances. And you can also see both functional seizure groups have much higher rates than the epilepsy controls only. So I'll then quickly talk about deprivation. So the Welsh Index of Multiple Deprivation basically splits all of Wales into sort of geographic areas where the deprivation is believed to be the same. And so if you had the all Wales population, each of these quintiles or fifths would have 20%. So any number higher than 20% means that people are coming from more deprived areas. So you can see about half of people from our functional seizure cohort are from the 2 most deprived quintiles in Wales. But what the wind doesn't tell you, even if you might live in deprived areas, how deprived someone is at a household level, which is what the census can give us. So moving on to the census results for our cohorts, we had pretty decent response rates for the 2011 census, around 3/4 of people. And the census, like I said, measures people at a household level. So we found that around 50% of our controls were deprived at a household level, which is around the same as what we'd expect based on the wind. But for the functional seizure and epilepsy groups, we can see around 3/4 of people, 4/5, were actually deprived at a household level. So what does it mean to be deprived at a household level from the census? Well, the census measures deprivation across 4 dimensions. So these would be the health dimension, employment, education, and housing. And I'll briefly say that we can see that people with functional seizures and epilepsy to an extent tend to be deprived in the health, employment, and education dimensions, but not really housing. So I'll now move on to employment. Our controls, around 50% answered the question of whether they're currently working as yes, versus only around 1/4 to maybe 1/3 of people with functional seizures or epilepsy. And I've not put all the different answers for the employment question here, but the main difference, the main cause for this discrepancy in the percentage of people currently working was that around only 4% of our controls reported being currently on long-term sick versus around 21% of people with functional seizures only, which I think the census data really shows how strongly this condition affects people's ability to live and work. So it's nice to have it backed up in the census data to show people. And so, although the unemployment rate was the same across all the cohorts, it really is this difference in whether people are currently working or on long-term sick. We can quantify this a bit further and say people with functional seizures only had half the rate of currently working compared to controls of the same age and sort of gender, and had over 4 times the rate of long-term sick leave, which is a similar pattern to people with epilepsy, but exacerbated with people with both conditions who had 6 times the rate of long-term sick leave. I'm now going to talk about hospital attendances. But some disclaimers, which I think some people have already mentioned. There's a lot of stigma towards people with FND and functional seizures, so a lot of people choose not to attend GPs or hospital because of this. So these results we've got sort of not capturing those people who might need or want treatment, but don't want to get it because of bad experiences and such. And a further thing, when we talk about emergency department admissions, oftentimes the decision to go to an emergency department is not made by the person with functional seizures, it's made by a carer or family member. So there's really two important things to talk about, I think, when it comes to talking about healthcare usage and hospital tendencies. So, okay, these three graphs, the top one shows emergency department visits, the second one shows outpatient appointments, and the third one shows inpatient admissions when someone's admitted to a bed in hospital. And these are scaled around someone's diagnosis. So the way to read this graph would be, if we take the orange line, people with functional seizures only, the year in which they're diagnosed, they have on average 2 visits to the emergency department, 4 outpatient appointments, and just over 1 case of being admitted to hospital and staying the night in a bed. And the key takeaway from this graph, I'd say, is that epilepsy hospital rates, the pink line, in all 3 graphs, decrease after a diagnosis is made. And for all across the cohorts, you can see the peak in terms of visits is around the diagnosis. But for both people with functional seizures only and people with functional seizures and epilepsy, the rate of visits across all 3 sort of visit types remains significantly elevated even after a diagnosis is made, which we believe could really reflect the lack of effective treatment available for people after a diagnosis is made. We roughly estimated the healthcare cost per person in the cohorts based on outpatient appointments, emergency department visits, including whether people are arriving by ambulance, and inpatient admissions, so the number of days people are admitted for in a hospital bed. And in 2023, we found that people with functional seizures only had 4 times the sort of annual healthcare cost versus a non-seizure control, and the value we had was £3,000 per person versus around £700, which is higher than the healthcare cost of epilepsy. And people with both conditions, again, it's sort of exacerbated 6.6 times the sort of healthcare cost a year. So the big question is what's driving these higher costs? So in 2023, compared to controls, we found that people with functional seizures had 4.9 times more emergency department visits, and for those visits, they arrived by ambulance 3 times more often. They were admitted for 5.2 times as many days versus controls, but only, and I sort of say only, had 2.6 times more outpatient appointments. So I'd say the real picture here is that people with functional seizures are receiving emergency care, but not planned care. I'm now going to talk about mortality. So this graph on the right is a survival curve, and the way to read this graph is that the better the outcomes are for a cohort of people, the higher the line is, and the lower down, the worse the outcomes are. So we can see that our control line has the best outcomes, both sort of functional seizure groups sort of in the middle, and then you have people with epilepsy, this pink curve at the bottom. And I'd say that, yeah, outcomes for people with epilepsy are worse in the first few years, but by about year 7, it does seem like outcomes sort of start to converge. So you can sort of get some numbers from a graph like this, and we come up with the value that people with functional seizures had a 2 times higher risk of death across our study relative to controls. People with functional seizures and epilepsy appear to have the same risk as people with functional seizures only, and people with epilepsy only had a slightly higher risk than people with functional seizures, but the confidence intervals overlap, so it's not necessarily a significantly higher difference. We can then adjust our model to take into account comorbidities and other characteristics. So if we do so, we can see that first of all, the hazard ratios for people with functional seizures or functional seizures and epilepsy are still greater than 1. They're still greater than the control. Even when you take into account people's comorbidities, there's still an increased sort of risk of death. If we go in order, we found that people who had been prescribed antipsychotics or were frequent attendees to emergency departments, they had a higher sort of hazard ratio. Being male compared to being female, being from the most deprived quintiles had a slight increase in hazard, and being older at the age at which you're diagnosed. Interestingly, having a common mental disorder, so anxiety or depression or a severe mental illness, or bipolar, schizophrenia and migraine, seemed to have people had a decreased hazard of dying, which we believe could be an age effect where younger people are more likely to be diagnosed with this condition and therefore less likely to have died in the study period. The big question then is, well, what's the cause of death for these people? So I think Beata mentioned the International Classification of Diseases, 10th revision, where basically every condition has a code, and those codes are grouped into chapters. So what we can look at is the cause of death people had on their death certificate, broken down by ICD-10 chapter. So there were 4 chapters where people with functional seizures or epilepsy were more likely to have causes from these chapters on their death certificates. And these were diseases of the nervous system, which we're unsure if this could be people mistakenly putting an epilepsy code on the death certificate of someone with functional seizures. Chapters 19 and 20, which are external causes or suicides, there was twice the rate of these causes being listed on death certificates. And mental and behavioural disorders, there was a 1.6 times increased rate. So the pattern was broadly similar for people with functional seizures only, functional seizures and epilepsy, or epilepsy. It was the same 4 chapters where you had this significantly increased rate relative to controls. And perhaps interestingly, there was not an increased rate of death caused amongst any other ICD-10 chapter for any of the cohorts, not people with functional seizures only, epilepsy only, or both conditions. So nothing metabolic, digestive, respiratory, and that leads me on to my conclusions. Hopefully I haven't rattled through it too quickly. So the main conclusion I'd say is that the incidence and prevalence of functional seizures that we found is much higher than previous studies. And like I said, this is kind of the first population level study that we're aware of, and that our results are despite us only seeming to be able to identify around half of the people who we know to have functional seizures in our data. And this increased incidence could be due to better coding, GPs and doctors actually recording the condition properly in data. It could be because there are more neurologists available to diagnose the condition and there's more awareness of the condition, or it could be a genuine increase in the number of people developing the condition. We don't know yet and can't tell from our data. I'd say the picture is really, really clear from our results that people with functional seizures have higher rates of healthcare utilisation, psychiatric comorbidity, so rates of anxiety and depression, and higher mortality compared to non-seizure controls. And one sort of potential use from our study could be that certain characteristics from our sort of hazard model, so being prescribed antipsychotics, being frequent attendees sort of A&E, and perhaps being male, could be used to sort of prioritise people with functional seizures who might be at higher mortality risk. So people we see in clinic with these conditions, maybe this is something to be mindful of. Thank you very much for listening. We probably have time for any questions.
Great, thanks very much, Russell. Yeah, we'll take a few questions. We've got a few minutes and then we'll have a break, hopefully have us to hopefully we'll get some drinks arriving, but I'm not quite sure. There's lots of cutbacks in the NHS.
First off, thank you for the speech. You mentioned about people in like deprived kind of areas. Both me and Mo have been told we got FND, and we're in a high story, six floors up, so we heavily rely on lifts which keep breaking down. Now in Wales, you're not allowed a bungalow unless you're 55, which we have tried asking for like a bungalow to make it easier for us both. Being told flat out no, unless you buy one yourself you can't have one. So with us, I think a lot of our anxiety for us is living so high up and relying on lifts that keep breaking down, and I think that doesn't help with any of our conditions either. I haven't really I don't have seizures, like visible seizures. I have stroke symptoms a lot, and the reason why I don't attend A&E is because, to me, my experience is I just get palmed away when I try it. A neurologist has said, he's emailed my GP several times, and I don't see no one in person. Put on different tablets and see what happens to them, which to me I don't feel I'm getting looked at. So I've asked to try see Pickrell and said, because I haven't seen this new rule. Been like it's 4 years now, I haven't seen no one. And that's why I don't bother going to A&E. I just suffer at home instead. So to me, at the minute, I don't feel I'm getting much help. So I kind of put off going. There's no point. So I just suffer at home instead.
Sorry to hear that.
No, I've been struggling. I've been reaching out, and because of all the problems, I've also got anxiety, depression. So everything I'm going through, it makes it worse. And I'm sorry, it is a trigger warning. A couple of weeks back, I had enough. Because I just felt I wasn't being listened to. I did go to hang myself. My wife stopped me. I tried hanging myself on my balcony. My wife stopped me. But I just didn't know whether there's anything that government know about, whether there's any chance government or councils can try to, okay, well maybe we can get bundles for people that are younger than 55 to help. So I'm sure there'd be many people that if they had bungalows rather than flats, it'll improve their quality of life. So I don't know whether there's anything you know, or whether there's been discussions about that with your clinic or anything.
Yeah, no, that's a really good one, and I'm really sorry for your experiences, and people here to help. And in the second half as well, we're going to talk a bit more about support and treatment options, and we can go through with those. But I think your experiences unfortunately are common. In terms of support and accommodation is obviously very important, and part of what we're still talking about is access to things is deprivation. Is that it doesn't necessarily mean money and things, but access to things and access to the right accommodation.
Proper living accommodation is maintenance, and when you have to rely on lifts that keep breaking down, and you get stuck there. And it's happened before. Both lifts broke down, and our landlord said, well, we're not going to get it fixed for about a day or two. So we had to try to sit on the stairs and try and use our bumps to go up 35 stairs.
I know later in the second half of the talks there's talk on the FND pathway with Rob.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's sort of provisions in place for that, or Rob would be a good person to talk to about that. But I know I forgot to mention this study that we're doing, we're hoping to publish probably later this year, and we really hope that a study like this will be really good evidence, so when there are calls for increased funding, people can point to this and go, look, these people are underserved, they're higher mortality, they're more deprived. This is a document that should help support increased funding, we hope.
Thank you.
Melissa.
Yeah, I was just wondering, when you've said about increased mortality and you've got frequent hospital admission, do you manage to break that down any further to how many actually died in hospital?
We haven't looked at that yet, sorry.
Yeah, that's a good point.
But it should be something we could look at before.
It's great work. Really lovely work, important work. I had a question about your health cost utilisation. You had a metric, and you showed it going up. It went up after diagnosis. So I guess my question is, there's a study in neurology where they looked at, it's an Australian study, and they looked at healthcare utilisation and costs before and after diagnosis. And they divided it up, and they used some metric to divide it up into effective communication of a diagnosis, so robust kind of communication and an empathic kind of way that a patient can understand and get a handle on, versus a non-robust form of communication. And they showed that the costs escalated significantly with the non-robust, method, where you haven't got epilepsy, goodbye, versus not treatment, so just how you communicate it and how you explain it. Whereas they showed if you communicate it more effectively and offer follow-up, for example, at least one follow-up, your costs diminish or stay the same. So I guess my question to you is, it's definitely worth having a look at if you haven't come across that. But also, is there a way you could use the kind of rich data that you have to kind of look at a surrogate of whether, you know, it's not so much about treatment's obviously important, but part of treatment is effective communication and, you know, not just discharging at the point of diagnosis, but at least offering some form of follow-up for questions, etc. Is there a way you could use a surrogate measure in your data? I mean, things like follow-up appointments after diagnosis or something like that, where you could also say effective, non-effective, what happens to the costs?
I think there definitely would be scope to sort of almost track people, not in a bad way, you know, whether they're getting follow-up appointments or not, how much they're engaging or what treatments they're being offered. Yeah, but I think it's probably beyond the scope of this one, but maybe in the next study. I don't know, there was also talks of tracking people through the census, because we have the 2011 and 2021, so seeing if people were diagnosed in between the census and whether that changed their answers and their outcomes. But again, probably not within this study. But yeah, I think there is the data to do that.
It's another good point, isn't it? I think Rob mentioned it in his video that there are things we can do, and that's the super clear first thing to do, isn't it? Be clear about the diagnosis.
I think it's uncertainty a lot of the time. Patients with a diagnosis that leads to current presentations.
But I wonder if that uncertainty as well is because we're missing 50% of people, how many of them are less certain cases, which are then leads down to them actually not even coming into this at all as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. We are talking missing. Yeah. There's some online questions.
There are. I think the one that sticks out is same person again. Was crime rate and nature-rich areas of individuals mapped? Nature-rich, rural, semi-rural, safe, low crime rate, inclusive community versus high urbanised, high crime rates. Were those kinds of things looked at?
I didn't look specifically at crime and nature in an area. I think I forgot to define the wind. I talked about the area-based metric of deprivation. I don't know if that takes into account. I think it takes into account urban versus rural, so it might be encapsulated a little bit in the Welsh Index of Multiple Deprivation, but not directly within it.
I think I can't be sure off the top of my head. I think some kind of measure for crime rates is, and we can, but I don't think we have looked at urban rural classification. Some people with the say they do clever studies looking at proximity to green spaces and health conditions as well, so it's certainly an option for further studies, yeah.
Thank you.
Is there another online question? Anyone from the audience?
I think this is more of a general one for later on really, but we'll go with it.
Okay.
Do we class functional tremors and facial ptosis as seizures? And I did have to look up how you say ptosis a little bit. It came through and I went, what?
So functional tremors.
Facial ptosis.
Yeah, I suppose like others in the room may know more than me, but like any symptom, there are different causes. So seizures have different causes. One of them are functional seizures, one of them is epilepsy. Tremors have different causes, like for example Parkinson's or essential tremor, but functional neurological disease is also a cause of tremor, as well as ptosis, which is eyelid drooping, isn't it? That's what ptosis means. It's a difficult way to say, isn't it? Ptosis, yeah. Which I think can be part of functional neurological disease as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
And tics, I believe, as well.
Good. Any more questions?
Sorry, my question is, my husband Ashley, he has the eyelid drooping, and he was diagnosed by letter in 2021 with FND. So how confident can we be of that diagnosis without actually seeing a doctor and without actually having all the tests done to eliminate anything else? So how confident can we be? Because he does have the eyelid drooping, and you just said that is part of FND. So would that be FND then? That's what I'm asking really.
I think, like any sort of condition or diagnosis, you need to make a careful assessment, isn't it? And things can change and get things wrong, but yeah, we need, I think we would say you need to be careful. It can be difficult to be exactly sure the cause of symptoms sometimes as well, and there will always be some uncertainty. Good. Okay. Well, thanks for your attention. Thanks for listening. Some great questions. We've got planned about a half an hour or so break now, and then in the next half we've got some talks more from Asia and Margaret and Rob about what's often support and the FND pathway will. So don't go away, come back. There's still lots of exciting stuff to come. Yes, there's tea and coffee. And there should be tea and coffee.
There should be tea and coffee.
Very good, yeah.
Okay, welcome back. Croeso nôl to the second half, and so this half now we're talking a bit more about support and treatment options for people with functional seizures, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Tasia to us this afternoon. And in our project, as well as clinicians and researchers, we're really lucky to have support of FND Hope and people with lived experience, and I think that's really helped us as a team in the project. And I'll leave Tasia explain a bit more about that now.
Thank you. All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tasia. I'm here with Nikki on behalf of FND Hope International. FND Hope has worked in partnership with this incredible team of doctors and researchers to provide the patient perspective. Today I'm going to be covering an introduction to FND Hope and my perspective, explain the role of an expert by experience and what that looks like for this project, the value for this project and the hopeful impact it will have for patients, and moving forward with future collaboration. So you might be wondering, who is this random human with a strange accent talking about Welsh healthcare? So I'll go ahead and introduce myself. I've lived in the UK for several years studying pharmacy, but obviously that's not why I'm here today. So most importantly, the topic of functional seizures is meaningful to me on a very personal level. I was diagnosed with functional seizures when I was 17, and I was also someone who is labeled as complex in the context of other underlying neurological conditions. And I never thought that I would be where I am today. So I live independently in a different country from my family. I study something that I love, and most importantly, I feel like I'm happy. I am here today because I know the power of good FND treatment. I know that more people deserve access to it all over the world. And I know that there can be systemic barriers to delivering treatment and the research needed to delivering good treatment. So I work with FND Hope International as the young adult peer support lead a member of the Research Board and Research Collective, and as an expert by experience on many studies like this one. Okay. FND Hope International is the first and only global charity for people diagnosed with FND. It was founded in 2012 with the mission to promote awareness, support affected individuals, and advance research for the prevention, treatment, and recovery from FND. Our reach is large. We serve over tens of thousands of individuals from around the globe and connect people from over 90 countries. We also serve hundreds of patients a month through virtual peer support groups. Over a third of these patients are based in the UK. And research is a vital part to the FND patient community, and FND Hope has included advancing research as part of our core mission from the beginning. To date, we have collaborated on over 200 research projects, including recruiting participation for patients for research participation, providing constructive feedback on studies, engaging qualified volunteers as experts by experience for direct collaboration, promoting the use of respectful terminology and language that expands treatment access and understanding, and emphasizing research that aims to expand treatment access and understanding. And we also are proud to announce that we have historically hosted an FND patient registry, and we are excited to be soon launching the updated version. This will be a collection of patients with vetted diagnoses and enable researchers to easily find patients that meet their study criterion, for example, location, symptom subtypes, and for patients to elect to engage in studies that are eligible to advance research and treatment with minimal administration work for both parties. So I think it's important that I acknowledge my perspective, and I initially came to FND Hope as a patient looking for peer support and to meet more people with the condition. And I grew to lead a young adult group of people aged 18 to 28 that meets twice a month of people living with FND, and I also work with pediatric patients that are too young for our teenage group. So I asked people in both of these groups, many of whom I'm very lucky to call my friends, their proudest and happiest moment since being diagnosed with FND. So I share these pictures not to convey that FND is an easy condition to have, but rather to show the human side of who will be impacted by increased care access and understanding of the condition. It is easy to lose sight of the actual people whose data we studied, of course unintentionally, when we're looking at an algorithm that has produced data from thousands of anonymized NHS codes. On the screen behind me, you can see that behind this data of mortality rates, A&E attendance rates, medication histories, and comorbidities, there are stories of resiliency and determination, and that hopefully this project and care pathway will help these people's stories be more defined by pictures like the one on the screen, and less of stories of hospital admissions and medication intake forms. So although I am not from Wales, where I was diagnosed with FND, I wasn't given any care access. There was no care treatment pathway. And I was privileged to be able to travel and find the care. But I know firsthand how hard it is not to have care access. And I also know that I would not be here today if it weren't for my own privilege in being able to access care. So I am so grateful that this is starting to no longer be true for the thousands of people whose data we have analyzed. Now that you understand my perspective a little more, I did want to share that FND Hope is always a team and collaborative effort. And there were two other great people here that helped make this happen from our perspective. Bridget Milden is our founder and CEO and also worked on this project with me as an expert by experience. And she was at every meeting and sends her apologies for not being able to attend in person. And then Nikki over here at the booth, she serves as our community engagement manager and has been tremendously helpful at assisting with the event coordination. So what is this word that I keep saying, expert by experience, or EBE? I know that many of you already know, but just to refresh, it's a person with lived experience navigating FND, or the condition being studied. It's typically a patient or a caregiver, and we are usually advocates for the condition in a broader sense and have medical and research professional experience outside of this lived experience. We're included at early stages when methodology changes can still be made, and then at every step of the process. And we provide a unique perspective on how to best capture the data, so what data is actually being captured, and then how to interpret the data. So I was one of the EBEs along with Bridget from FND Hope that helped with this study. So our role, we attended team meetings virtually, helped with publications, and event organization. The main thing I think we did is provided a unique perspective on potential reasons for significant findings to help frame the context. So, for example, one thing that's already been discussed is healthcare utilization, and I want to highlight something, especially in the context of comorbid epilepsy, that this, from a lived experience perspective, highlights that many people, both caregivers and clinicians alike, including paramedics or potentially A&E staff or even neurology, may struggle to differentiate between epilepsy and functional seizures in the context of a dual diagnosis, and have a far lower threshold for care escalation or emergency attendance. This highlights to me a vital need to further train and individualize treatment plans for people with both diagnoses to help reduce the impact that unnecessary admissions might have on their life, and especially for caregivers, lower any anxiety when a seizure is occurring and increase their certainty and able to capture what is actually happening. It is also worth noting that the study shows data in the context of there not being a national care pathway, which thankfully has just changed, and that patients with functional seizures had incredibly limited access to care. So in the absence of outpatient services, it is well known across any condition that patients and caregivers in acute illness or exacerbation do present to emergency services. And this study reaffirms the value of a care pathway and the need for better outpatient and long-term services. Our role was also to highlight potential places to further analyze data where possible. So unfortunately, we weren't able to differentiate the reason for healthcare utilization across all groups, and if it was for epilepsy or functional seizures or other chronic conditions. So Bridget and I raised the importance of differentiation of acuity through inpatient admissions from general wards to intensive care to get a more nuanced picture of the healthcare utilization occurring. And of course, as with any project, there was a shared overall goal to ensure that data is captured in a way that best represents why it is happening and how to use this to help move forward and improve care and care access. This project has truly been one of my favorites to collaborate on. There was a clear and direct impact to patients, which I think, unfortunately, in clinical research is not always true. It sometimes takes longer to trickle down. So I've been incredibly grateful to be a part of it, and I think Dr. Powell is going to discuss that later, the care pathway. But I think it goes beyond that because there, as the first population level study, there's acknowledgement of the real impact that FND has on an individual level and a population level, and knowing that there are so many people in Wales living with this condition will hopefully increase legitimacy and recognition and allow for increased services and funding. And an increased understanding of things that contribute to increased mortality rate, interplay with socioeconomic status, and comorbid conditions clearly needs to be researched, but this can provide a framework and context to support that further research. Before I end, I wanted to provide some resources that FND Hope offers. The first here on the screen is our peer support calendar. So I mentioned that I lead one of the groups, but we have a lot of amazing groups for patients. And it can be really helpful for patients to meet other people with FND, to feel less isolated, to feel less misunderstood, and to gain resources and skills from other patients. So we offer a range of peer support from just general anyone with FND from anywhere over the world, to a group just for people in the UK, to people in the queer community, to men, because often our peer support spaces are dominated by women, so we have a group just for men. We have the young adult group, we have a teen group. If you have a pediatric patient that is below the age of 13, I'm happy to do individual mentoring with them. And then our most popular groups are things like art and book club, where we talk about anything but FND, but everyone on the call has FND. And so those can be quite popular. And then this next one is a provider registry. It's a tool that we use on our website for patients and clinicians to find other providers treating FND. We also have a paper form if the QR code's not working for you. Please fill out this form. You do not have to be a physician. You do not have to be a psychologist. If you're a mental health nurse, if you are rehabilitation staff, having your information can be a vital way for patients to find you and for other clinicians to find you, because we know that it can be hard to access care. And, sorry. Research is really important to FND Hope, and we have always viewed it as a critical part of our organization. So we are always looking to collaborate with clinicians, researchers, and patients alike to advance our understanding and treatment. So if you'd like to get in touch, you can contact us here, or you can come over to us at the table. Before I end, I do want to give a heartfelt and genuine thank you to the researchers on this project. This was definitely not an easy undertaking, and their schedules are very busy. I'm acutely aware that for every idea I had, it put a lot on Russell's plate. So I'm very grateful to the thoughtfulness and dedication that was shown to make this happen. Does anyone have any questions?
First off, obviously well done for everything. First off, did you do like different courses, supplement? For everything I do, my coping mechanism I do a lot is I do poetry. Would there be any interest in poetry classes at all?
There's a journaling group, and I think that might be the closest one we have right now.
Okay.
You might want to give that a try. And we're always looking to start more groups. If you want to start your own, we can do a training and get that started.
Because I thought, like sometimes it's hard to put into words
Yeah.
you feel it, but then I do it by writing poetry, and I think sometimes it may help if other people could do that as well.
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
We're keeping a catalogue of poems, stories, patient stories, lots of other things. If you contact us, we'll take your details through contact. We're just keeping things on a registry at the moment so that we can keep hold of it and then share it so that we can add them to our newsletter, to our online magazine, to other things like that. So, we'll have a word.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you.
Hiya, it's a great presentation, thank you. I just wondered, so clearly it's been like an amazing synergistic relationship in terms of PPI that you guys have provided from the work that's been done at Swansea. In your experience, and you've obviously worked with lots of projects, what are the sort of bits of advice you'd give to researchers to make it work well? What are the pitfalls? What are the things
I think the first thing is to involve us early. If we're involved post IRB approval, it becomes incredibly frustrating because I often have pretty unique ideas on how to best capture data, and then we have to do IRB amendment paperwork if that affects the methodology of the study. And to me, I have a lot of respect for the researchers, but if they know they're going to include me, then they should include me before they submit for IRB, because I might have ideas that affect the information that they submit. And I think you guys did a great job of doing that. I think the other thing that I always make clear is don't be scared to offend me. I think sometimes when I start on projects, it feels like I'm walking on eggshells, and it's very palpable. And I'm like, I was a theater kid in high school. Like, I promise I have thick skin. But I think it makes it hard to have a productive conversation if both parties are like, so, I mean, I might push back if people say something that I disagree with, but I'd rather people feel like they can be honest with me.
That's super helpful.
Yeah. Any other questions?
We have none online. We've been stunned by your brilliance, Alicia. It's a compliment.
Go ahead. Take a roll from Margaret. Okay. All right, so it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. It's Margaret. Margaret has worked as an occupational therapist in the Swansea community mental health teams for over 20 years and was referred several people with FND. Over the years, she has read all the research articles she could find, brought lots of books, and joined the FND Society and AHP FND Network, and she also is in Professor Rob Powell's Neurological Conditions Network that wrote the FND Pathway for Wales. And she has helped set up a support group in March 2023 when she retired from the NHS. And she has helped provide limited and informal resources for people with FND, which will be the focus of her talk today.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Yes, my name is Margaret. I worked in community mental health for a very, very long time. I worked in community mental health for a very long time, which I really did enjoy. I was in two minds whether to retire in February 2023 or not, but I did, and it's given me a 24/7 opportunity to work for FND. As a result, I've got no one saying prioritise this meeting, get your care plans up to date. What I want to do, I do, and I do it when I want. It's brilliant, I recommend retirement. But so I did have a few people with FND referred to me. Why they came to me, I don't know, but I seem to be the only one in Swansea Health Board that had any FND clients. So I was pretty much on my own, as indeed they were. So we sort of forged our paths together, a voyage of discovery, with a few alarming incidents, but a good laughs along the way. So I decided that I would set up a group to help people when I retired. I chose Crest, which is now it calls itself a recovery college. It's in Cumbria. I chose there because I'd worked from there. I knew the staff, they knew me, they knew some of my FND clients as well, so they had a bit of an understanding about FND. It's a very welcoming place, very friendly. It also has free parking and, importantly, it has disabled access. We meet twice a month on the first and Thursdays between about 2 and 4 p.m. Not everybody can come on a Thursday afternoon. I hadn't sort of taken any notice of school pick-up times, for example. So now and again we meet informally in Zinco Lounge in town because then it enables other people to attend. It's a very, very informal group. Please just come along. There's, from the point of view of professionals, there's no paperwork, there's no referral forms. Just let me know, turn up. If you'd like to contact me first to get more confidence, I'm very welcome to talk to anybody first. I don't keep office hours, so any time of day will do. Family and friends are also welcome because, of course, FND isn't a private affair, it ripples outwards. We actually have a WhatsApp chat group as well, which has apparently 47 members. This is just in the Swansea area. The group comprises people who came from the very beginning. Maybe they don't come anymore, and I hope the reason they don't come is they got what they want from the group rather than they didn't get anything at all from the group. And there were a few people who have transport issues, they can't get here, or they haven't quite worked up enough confidence to attend yet. But 50 old people in just the Swansea area does show a rather alarmingly high level of unmet need, I would say. A couple of years ago I set up a Facebook page, and now you also have a website, courtesy of my son. Everything is done on a limited budget, well, no budget actually, because the budget is actually called my private bank account. So it's all done on the cheap, so hence I basically have a free website. Well, I've got some cards if you want to make a note of that. We get our members from neurologists, Crest itself, mental health teams, the hospital, Neathcote Talbot Hospital. I've emailed all the local area coordinators in Swansea and Neathcote Talbot. I've emailed all the social prescribers at the GP clusters. Some of the group are my former clients for CMHTs. And we have word of mouth members, and I must admit to stalking Facebook as well. If I find anybody on some of the Facebook groups who I think, I wonder if they're local, I go into their what's there about information, and if they might possibly be from this area, I try and target them. And we have had 1 or 2 people that way. So the purpose and benefits of the group, well, I think the most important factor is that it reduces isolation. So people meet others facing similar challenges in a similar situation. They understand each other, and from what I've heard people say, this seems to be the most important thing about a group, is the social aspect, the lack of isolation, the joint understanding. It's an opportunity to share experiences, to share coping strategies and tips, also to share contacts and advice on symptoms, because, as we all know, there's little or no access to sort of timely medical advice, really. That's part of the reason the pathway has been set up. And also, importantly, it's an opportunity to share grumbles and complaints, because, you know, a little bit of grumbling and complaining is not good for you now and again. It's quite therapeutic, but no more than 20 minutes, and then we have to move on. As I said, it's a very informal group. Conversation just naturally flows. There's nothing laboured about it. We just sit down and we're like this. Sometimes a whole group is involved in a conversation. Sometimes it breaks up into groups of 2 and 3. It doesn't really matter. I feel very strongly that information and education is the cornerstone of recovery. So I personally would like to introduce a little bit more structured and formal sort of information giving to the group. This isn't always very welcome. People have a different idea, and if that's what they want to do, that's absolutely fine. If anybody wants to speak to me and we can sort of hammer out sort of personal interpretation of their FND, that's fine too. We can go away in a quiet little corner for a private conversation. Our group did make some suggestions towards the pathway, and when we had the first draft, that was circulated and we discussed it and came up with a couple of amendments as well. The group has developed from simply a support group to being a little bit more proactive in trying to raise awareness and make some contacts. So quite a while ago now, between us, we targeted about half the GP surgeries in Swansea. We gave them some information, which I believe, I'm sorry to say FND Hope, but it was from FND Action. But I've used your literature in other events. It's been invaluable. I gave them some posters as well, and a letter to explain, I didn't just walk off the street and bombard them with this. But unfortunately, not one of us has seen any of the posters up in any of the GP surgeries. I've been to some information events. The Swansea Council has a one-stop info shop every month. I've been to one of those, or 2. Football stadiums. I hate football, but I've got to be very grateful to the football club for setting up an information event and providing lots of tea and coffee and fruit and biscuits. It was really good. I did Crest Fest last month, setting up a table with some information and freebies, and I did a presentation at the Crest as well for the Mental Health Awareness Week. I've got some freebies which I give out to, keep our group uppermost in people's minds. Pens, there's a bit of a standing joke among our group, because everyone knows full well I have a passion for pens. I'm on my 4th lot from pens.uk, and I've done a cheap version from Timu because they were cheaper, but not so good. But if anyone wants a pen to, remember me by, and remember, to refer people to us, they are welcome. They're in my bag. Tomorrow we've got one of the Senedd members coming. I've written to all the Senedd members for this area, and also to the new Health Secretary for Wales, Mabon ap Gwynfor. I haven't heard back from him, but I've had responses from 2 of the Senedd members and the Swansea West MP, Torsten Bell. So we've got 2 Assembly members, and Torsten Bell are coming to our group for the next 3 meetings. So to raise awareness and beg for support, financial support and encouragement to set up the pathway. A couple of years ago, we got ourselves on TV, just a 2 or 3 minute clip on the Welsh News. And if you go on our the Facebook page, it's called FND Together. Scroll down to the bottom and you can see the clip for a couple of minutes if you would like to. Recently, we had some cards made, just credit card size plastic cards, for people who are out and about but facing impatience and misunderstanding from people like that's it. From people like, say, bus drivers or shop assistants who are, losing their rag. Come on, dear, you could get on the bus perfectly well last time. Hurry up. So we can scratch the cards and say, ask for a little bit of understanding and patience. So if anybody would like one, I have some with me. All the people I've liaised with, apart from those ones I've already mentioned, OTs at Kevin Croyd as well, which I worked under. We're under Swansea Council for Voluntary Service as well. We have a mention in Hope in Swansea. I have liaised with FND Dimensions and FND Friends as well, and neurophysios in Kenfig and Newport, and also Beth, she's a student nurse up in North Wales. She's managed to get herself giving lectures to medical students and all manner of people, GPs and so on up in North Wales. She's actually setting up a charity, a Wales-wide charity called FND Cymru. And she suggested to me perhaps we might join forces with that. So we'll see where that takes us. So lastly, that's about that in a nutshell. But I always like to say thank you to Crest for their welcome and sharing their premises with us twice a month, and for my brilliant group. But I've learned a lot from my brilliant group. And I've got to say, you're all quite inspirational the way you cope with FND day in, day out against all the challenges. So thank you. I don't suppose there's any questions, it's quite straightforward, but...
Really well done. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions?
Vicky, I have one online for you.
Oh, online? Right, okay.
Yes, I think it's somebody local, so I'm going to send them your contact details anyway. Question for Margaret. How do I get CMHT to properly diagnose... No, start again, Nikki. Start again. How do I get my CMHT to properly consider my FND diagnosis and neurodivergence in my care plan? The psychiatrist doesn't see it as his role. Health professionals, present company accepted, are not holistic. I'll just pass on your details, shall I?
That's a good idea. I mean, that is a $64,000 question,
yes,
isn't it? There's no really succinct answer.
Sorry. They can hear me because I'm chatting at home.
Okay.
So yes, if I ask them to contact you, would you know your contact details? Have you got them verbally?
Yeah, do you want, yes, it's mgt.stevens@gmail.com.
Lovely, thank you very much.
Yeah, I welcome emails anytime. That's absolutely fine. Feel free.
Thank you for answering, Margaret.
Sorry, Margaret. Obviously, I've seen you in Zinco. I've not yet been able to come to the Crest meetings, which I will at some point. But does everyone know about the National Disability Scheme that you could get there? That you could do is you could go online. Then I think it's £20. It lasts for a year or two to get a National Disability card, and then I think you get you could get if you wear it, you can go in front of certain queues and stuff like that as well. I don't know whether anyone knew about that with the FND. Yeah, you could get certain vouchers. I don't know whether anyone knew where that you could get that. So I don't know whether it's something that we can make more aware and more well known. People.
Useful.
Yeah, no, that's what I was thinking of. But I'm hoping as it continues, they ask this Thursday, so that's why we don't get to go. But
yeah,
I can't remember what time it is. What time is the meeting you have in the Crest?
2 till 4.
Every Thursday?
No, first and third Thursdays of the month.
Right, okay. I'll definitely have to try and get down again. So it'll be interesting. That's good.
Yeah, that would be good to publicise.
Yeah, I try to think, just so everyone knows that you can't get a disability card. So I know, like, I've had loads of people say to me, "Oh, you're not disabled, you're too young to have a disability." I've had police question me saying, "Are you disabled? Prove to me you're disabled." So I think I'm stuff like this as well. And like I know like you do a lot. You've done so much for FND, and we're on the group. So yeah, we do appreciate everything you've been doing as well. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Alright, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Rob Powell. He's a consultant neurologist at Morstan Hospital, Swansea, and an honorary chair at Swansea University Medical School. He has a clinical interest in epilepsy and sleep neurology, and is currently the secretary of the UK chapter of the International League Against Epilepsy and the clinical lead for the National Clinical Network for Neurological Conditions. So thank you so much, and he's going to be talking about the new care pathway.
Thanks a lot.
And can I just thank Margaret as well? So, I know your email address off by heart. You've handed out to so many patients, and I know that in an area where patients are constantly coming up against barriers to care, you're the person locally who's happy to see anyone, and groups really useful. So, my slides. Cheers. Okay, well, thanks very much. So I'm going to talk a bit today about the new national pathway for FND in Wales that we've worked on as part of the work of the Neurological Conditions Strategic Network. I would say I'd chosen the colour combination of my slides before I knew who England were playing in the semi-finals. There you go. So I always start these talks when I'm talking about neurological conditions in general by trying to emphasise, because I think neurological conditions have quite a low profile in terms of the media and the public and politicians. So I always try and say, why are they important? Well, they're really common. They have a wide range of different ways that they can present, and they can affect all aspects of the health service, whether it's primary care, emergency departments, inpatients. And this is just for neurological conditions in general, but we're in the top 3 for years of life lost and top 4 for years lived with disability. So that's neurological conditions in general. But I think you can say pretty much the same thing for FND. FND is really common. It has a whole range of spectrum of ways it can present. So today's talks are all about functional dissociative seizures, but there are other ways it can present, limb weakness, involuntary movements, cognitive problems, unsteadiness. So it can cause lots of different neurological conditions, and it can affect people of all ages. And I think the lack of services that we have, certainly in Wales, and the rates of misdiagnosis are real barriers towards effective care, make it life really difficult for patients with FND. In terms of the burden of disease, so I think the figures here underestimate the number of patients. So we talked to you about possibly 5,000 patients in Wales with FND. Well, I think we've seen from the results of the new research project is that's very much an underestimate. So that it's really common. It is similar to other conditions like MS, like Parkinson's disease, in terms of how common it is. It affects every aspect of the health service, as I've said. If you primary care, emergency departments, there's a real impact. These FND patients will come across FND patients wherever you are in the health service. And there are lots of costs of the condition, and that's both the direct costs of patients presenting to healthcare, but also the indirect cost of patients that being unable to work, benefits. And I think that is, as Mahinda was saying, that is important when we're trying to make the case for why we need better FND services in Wales. And we know that early diagnosis and intervention does make a difference in terms of outcomes for patients. So it is really important to try and get the diagnosis correct from the start. And we know that there's a real lack of services in Wales. So none of the health boards in Wales have got a designated FND service, and that's what we're trying to get at. Because these are the consequences. I mean, I see loads of FND patients, and I can see the impact that it has on them and their families. Diagnosis is often delayed, so patients have to navigate different parts of the health service before they get a diagnosis, and as a result, they'll end up coming back in and out of hospital, having lots of tests, sometimes being prescribed inappropriate medication, and as a result they have worse outcomes, and that in turn has its own economic consequence. I think for patients, their journey through health services is often very fragmented. I can see, I feel frustrated when I diagnose someone with FND or with functional seizures, and I can tell them what it is, and they're looking at me thinking, okay, so what happens next? And we don't really have that many options in terms of who do we refer them on to. In comparison, if I diagnose someone with epilepsy, I can say, okay, well, I'm going to refer you to the epilepsy nurse, I'm going to prescribe you this medication. There's a plan in place. same for MS. It doesn't feel like that's the same when you're diagnosing someone with FND. Sometimes it can be worse than that. You can come up against barriers with certain services sort of not accepting or saying they're not funded to see patients with FND, and all this is understandably a source of frustration and some of the stigma that goes with the diagnosis of FND. So I think that's why we need, so this is just another example of what data we've got. This is from the National Dashboard for Neurological Conditions. Again, almost certainly an underestimate. This is just recording patients who've been coded as having functional disorders. So this was across Wales, 40 patients in hospital over those months in Wales. And if we look at the big categories of neurological conditions, so at the bottom corner there, you've got headache, then Parkinson's, then epilepsy, and then the fourth one is undiagnosed neurological conditions. I think a big part of that would be FND. So it's in terms of the neurological conditions that cause patients to come into hospital. I think it's up there with the other big categories of disease. And the difference would be headache, MS, epilepsy would all have their own services. They'd have consultants who are specialists in that condition, they'd have specialist nurses, sometimes they'd have physio, psychologists, and FND patients don't have, in general, access to that same group of patients. So that's why, those are the reasons why we thought when we were looking at what our priorities for national neurological conditions in Wales, what we wanted to look at, we realised FND was one of the areas where there was a huge gap. And what we need is not necessarily, you might say, why do we need a pathway? What we need is more doctors and more nurses, more clinicians. But I think maybe this start is having a pathway, saying, well, what should services look like? And then that's something that hopefully we can take to politicians and health boards and start asking questions. So we formed a task and finish group made up of different professionals, so neurologists, psychologists, physios, other allied health professionals, patients and third sector involvement to try and draft what we thought a pathway should look like. And there's a lot in it, but I suppose these are the key take-home messages. So firstly, the importance of a diagnosis. So if FND is suspected, they should be seen promptly by a neurologist to try and get a diagnosis from the start. And that people shouldn't really, I think there was an agreement that people shouldn't be labelled or diagnosed as FND until they've had an appropriate assessment. And just like any other neurological condition, it should be diagnosis based on the clinical picture, what symptoms they've got, what findings they've got in examination, what their tests have shown. It shouldn't just be something that's diagnosed because everything else has been excluded. And once you've got a diagnosis, then you should be referred on for appropriate therapy services. The type of service that people need is based on their clinical need. So some people can be managed using existing services, community-based or hospital services, but then other more complex cases or where the diagnosis is less clear may need access to a sort of dedicated FND multidisciplinary team. And the aims of any services should be about recovery, about self-management, education, and trying to make sure that patients have got the tools they need to and access to the services they need to have good outcomes. We also talked about how it can be quite complicated to navigate through these systems. Patients often need the input of lots of different therapists, and how that was what led us to the idea of a navigator. So this would be a member of the team, so an existing member of staff assigned to each patient to help them navigate through and sort of join up and coordinate their care, which we know can be a challenge for patients. So this is the main sort of flow chart of the pathway, and sort of go from the top, patients are referred in, and they'll usually come up to us either by primary care or emergency departments, And it's important that they have that initial neurological assessment to establish the diagnosis clearly from the start. And then there's a tiered approach to treatment and therapies here based on patients' clinical need. So patients may be with milder symptoms, sometimes just a clear explanation of the symptoms, and involvement of local community-based therapy services can be enough. Some patients then will need slightly more intensive input from existing therapy services attached to the local neurology service. But then there's definitely a need for some patients who've got more complex disease or higher burden of symptoms who'll need access to dedicated FND services. And this doesn't exist at all in Wales at the moment. There isn't a single FND MDT team for these patients. And we haven't specified at what level that should sit, but I think it's probably not realistic for every hospital or every health board to have one of these, but certainly across South Wales there should be at least one FND MDT, arguably one for the east, one for the west. There's certainly enough patients, I think, to say that's what we should be aiming for. And then again, we've always got access to, on an individual patient-funded basis, to some of the centres in England where they do inpatient neurorehabilitation. So these sort of levels are based on clinical need, and should be a dynamic system, so reflecting the fact that patients can fluctuate. Some patients can go into remission and then relapse in terms of their symptoms. So patients will maybe go from, they get worse, they can go escalate their way through these levels of care, but also as they improve, they don't necessarily need such regular feedback, but it's important they have access back into these services as well. So I think these are the important core elements of the pathway. There's timely diagnosis and intervention, that patients have access to a coordinated multidisciplinary care based on their clinical needs, that patients have access to specialist FND teams where that's needed. Education, as people have talked about already, is really important, both in terms of education for patients and their families, but also workforce education and training. We've heard a bit about how patients' experience of going to health services and being greeted by healthcare professionals who maybe haven't got that much knowledge about FND. So there's a bit of training of the workforce that's important as well. The role of navigators in helping patients coordinate their own care. And I think the need for more research and education around FND is clear, and that we should need to work out ways, in the same ways we do with other conditions, how do we measure patients' outcome? I think that's a challenge in neurological conditions generally, but certainly in FND, what sort of measures do you choose to see whether patients are benefiting from these services? So what are the next steps here? Well, I think there's still a lot of work to do in terms of raising awareness of FND and promotion of FND in order to try and implement this pathway. And I'd encourage everyone, patients, relatives, people working with FND patients to try and raise this every opportunity you get when you're talking to your managers or your health board, or if people have had bad experiences, let your health board know. We've got some political involvement now with the local group, so that's great, Margaret. I think we need to try and get FND on people's agendas, because it's just not at the moment. So promoting that education, awareness. I think the things we really want is, we want to know more about what exactly FND is, what the causes are, which is why the sort of work that you guys are doing and Mahinda's doing in London is really important. And we want to keep collecting the data to show how important this is, because what we're looking for in the end are better services for FND patients. So thanks very much.
Great, thanks very much, Rob. Great to see quite a lot of investment in time and energy to get this on the board and front, really. So yeah, any Any questions for Rob? Mahinda?
So Rob, obviously you have a lot of engagement presumably with management and commissioners. What in your experience are the biggest barriers to getting funding for these kind of services?
I mean, I think at the moment, obviously we're at a time where there's just very little funding, full stop, isn't there, for trying to get new services, and that's what we keep coming up against on a local level. But I think it's still a lack of awareness and understanding of quite what impact this has on health services in general, and it's being able to try and make the point that this isn't a kind of a niche or luxury service. You know, if you do this properly from the start, you will make savings. Patients you'll save in terms of inpatient admissions, ED attendances, all that. It's a kind of invest to save, isn't it? It's trying to make that case in a time where there's not much money around.
Online questions?
I do. A local patient, I'm guessing, online, asking what they should do if Navigator isn't working for them. Who do they go to next?
It's really difficult, isn't it? Would they be under a neurologist services thing?
I get the impression they've had a referral made. I don't want to read the question
sure.
out. It's not
I think
appropriate.
it feels at the moment that it's, as neurologists we tend to see the patients because they'll often present to us first, and then we feel that we don't really have that many options in terms of who we refer on to, so we rely a bit on voluntary groups like Margaret's. We'll see patients and follow them up, and we'll treat the things that we can treat, I suppose, associated symptoms, and we'll try and help direct them to help that they need. But it is challenging, so there is, at the moment, we act as the navigators a bit, but I think that's not always very effective.
It's the same in the UK, in England as well.
Yeah.
I have just as many issues over in England as well, so you're not unique, unfortunately.
Just want to comment online before we go to your question, actually, that that access to specialised FND services are in the English service specific agreement for neurology in England, so that's right.
Hi, I'm a psychologist working in the health board. In our service, we get a few referrals for children with FND or kind of needs. It comes with different labels. Are there any services that are specialist for children with this type of condition?
I'm not aware of any.
No,
locally or in Wales.
No.
Yeah, I think that there are individuals who've got an interest in FND, but I don't think there are any coordinated teams, which is really what particularly for the patients with the most difficult symptoms, you need a combination of neurologists, psychologists, physios, maybe OTs, maybe speech and language therapists. Everyone's slightly different, aren't they, in terms of what their main symptoms are, and I think it's the combination of all those people working together. That's what we need.
Yeah. Any question from the audience?
Just a query, within your pathway, just wondering where neurophysiology would sit in that, because obviously functional seizures are around 40% of our daily workload in neurophysiology, and we have a lot of information to give with regarding patient education amongst anything else. So much so, a lot of our undergrad and master's students' projects have been on functional seizures over the last 17 years, so we see a lot of it. So just wondering where we fit in your pathway.
Well, I suppose it's around that key part of the diagnostic tool, isn't it, for dissociative seizures. The neurophysiology and EEG is one of the key stages, and So you're obviously an untapped resource then, probably in terms of explanation, discussion, your experience of seeing these patients, and that may be something we haven't quite recognised enough. You know, we realise what a valuable diagnostic resource you are, but we're not making the most of it.
No, I'd agree with that. You know, obviously very good and very helpful and with us as well. So yeah, we certainly need to make more of that. Yeah. Another question for you.
I work in psychiatry. Where would you see sort of the role of psychiatry in the pathway that's proposed, and how do you see that looking going forward, really?
Yeah, so I think it's like we sort of put psychiatry in the bad choice of font. I can't read on. I think you come to the sort of allied. We sort of have a bit of a default response sometimes from psychiatry saying, you see this patient, they don't have a, you know, they're not depressed, they're not psychotic, we don't have that much too often. I think again, some patients there's a clear psychiatric comorbidity, where there's a big role for psychiatry. I think you should be part of the FND MDT for patients. Like I say, everyone's different, but a lot of people would benefit from psychiatric inputs. I don't know what your
I think from an outpatient perspective, we often see them co-occurring, and it's a challenge for us to manage the two of them essentially, and we sort of get caught a little bit in the middle of trying to manage this person. We need that sort of MDT approach, or have at least an avenue to sit down with the FND service to say how we best work to help this person from a psychiatric perspective, and then from there sort of FND really.
Yeah.
So I think it would be really helpful for us in psychiatry to have.
I think that's the problem. At the moment, everyone feels like they're trying to manage it in isolation.
Yes, yeah, that's it.
We feel like that in the role of clinics too. So yeah.
A lot of people have said to me that when you feel pain, don't need to wait until it opens, like just walk through it and you get better. Personally, I haven't experienced that. I don't feel it. I've tried and I still stumble. Do you think there's any truth in that, or is that just coming from people that don't understand the condition? And they say just no matter what you may have pain, do some exercises and then it'll go away and you can walk normal. Does that come from people that understand, or is there some truth in that?
I don't think that's a particularly sort of helpful thing to say, is it?
No, I mean, because the doctor told me, so doctor using a wheelchair, doctor using a walking stick, don't need some mobility scooter, just keep walking. And I said, but I keep stumbling, it's hard tomorrow, you'll be okay. You know, so, and it's maybe like, when they diagnose, you know, like with IBS, they say, oh, we don't know exactly what's wrong with the bowels, but it's something wrong with this irritated, so they just say IBS. Is that similar to FND? So they know it's something not right with the brain, but they don't exactly know what, and that's why they just call it FND.
Yeah.
Do you think it's like an umbrella term?
Yeah, I think it's saying that we, you know, for some reason the nervous system isn't working as well as it should, but it's not due to something obviously kind of structural that you can see on the scan. So a bit like, I think IBS is a good sort of, comparison.
Yeah. So obviously I know the brains can have a lot to do with IBS as well, just like that can be disorder signals. So the brain can tell the bowels that start having spasms, so it controls the legs, it starts being weak and wobbly, or the speech. I suppose just obviously it's probably going to take a lot of work to try and find out whether there's anything between. Like one of my neuro, but I've never seen him, all he does is say to my GP, put him on loads of different medication, see what happens. I don't want to be a guinea pig in that respect. I don't want to just take medication if it's not going to help me. I want to be able to see him in person, so I can actually, so you can see me in person, see the problem, and tell me exact symptoms I have, and do it that way, rather than trying to put me on loads of different medication and see what happens. I mean, obviously I am interested in trying to see more studies, try and just get more information, and like when we started about the facts and myths, when we first started, like I guess a myth would be just walk through the plane and be fine. And you start walking like normally, your body will remember it. I'm guessing that's a myth. Because I'm guessing it's just don't understand the condition, I'm guessing.
Is there one more?
I do.
Sorry.
It's okay. I have two questions, one from myself, which I don't think you'll have the answer to, but we'll ask it anyway. But the one from online is what can patients do if their neurologist is clearly not following the pathway or only doing one aspect of it? Yeah, I wasn't going to ask it, to be fair.
Well, I think, hopefully the pathway, I guess, is to try and show our managers and help us what services should look like, which are not. Unfortunately, those services are not there at the moment, so I can understand patients say, well, why is my service not looking like this pathway? What we're saying at the moment is this is what it should look like, it's not what it looks like yet. So any individual patient, if you're really not happy with your person you see, you can always ask for a second opinion or something else.
What system do you have in place? This is kind of on top of that, really. What system does Wales have in place if a patient isn't happy with the care they receive from their team? Because in England we have PALS, Patient Advice Liaison. Is that something that is in Wales too?
Yeah, similar things, you can see.
So that's the way to go.
Yeah.
My golden question, I think from every FND patient listening and here in the room, is when do you foresee a time in the future when our FND care will be as automatic as a patient with MS, Parkinson's?
Yeah, that's good, but I think we're probably at the stage now where I think when I started training in neurology, which was quite a while ago, MS was, you didn't have MS services like there are now. There were big MS groups, and we were starting to understand more about the condition, and that then led to treatments, and that's probably what led to teams being formed of MS consultants, MS nurses, which is standard now wherever you are in the country. You'll have access to an MS team, and I think that's what we've got to aim for with FND, but we're still probably at the bottom of that hill at the moment. That was so I've seen the changes in MS in my career as a neurologist, which is 20 years or so. That's what I'd hope to see in FND.
I can honestly say in the 5 years since my diagnosis, as much as I know that FND patients really feel it really badly at the moment, that everything, your world is imploding, things are getting better.
I echo that.
5 years ago, 10 years ago, there's a saying within the NHS, I'm ex-NHS, by the way, it takes, it's something like, to make any changes within the NHS, it's like watching a lorry trying to do a three-point turn. And that's sometimes how long it takes for any service to change. So we are getting there, but we also recognise that we're not there yet. And that's good, because that means that we're staying highlighted. It means that there is still a focus, not a big enough focus, not enough being done, but things are changing, honestly.
Great. I think we'll take one last question, and then we'll wrap it up.
It wasn't a question, but I wanted to sort of say that I'm in quite a unique situation, and I touch on adult services and paediatric services, as my two daughters started having seizures within a month of each other, and one was 18 and one was 14, so I had a separate sort of route to go, both with completely different diagnoses given. One, the elder one, diagnosed with epilepsy first, medications given, increasing seizures, later diagnosed with dissociative seizures, and the other one with non-epileptic attack disorder. Both turned away after diagnosis, and the youngest one waiting for CAMS referral for 7 months, with no, I had to fight for that because it wasn't offered. The eldest one sent through psychiatry, and eventually given a dissociative seizure diagnosis. They are both now free of seizures. That was 2020, and they have both recovered. My youngest daughter didn't finish school. She was having 7 seizures a day, lasting an hour each. As I said to your colleague, you know, with a full range, I've never seen anything like it in my life, lasting all day, ending up with regressive seizures, drop seizures, grand mal seizures, the full works, and the other one the same as well. I remember sitting on the landing, one of them having a seizure and I having to call an ambulance, and the other one having a seizure and my son having to deal with that one. You know, all of the services that I had touched on had no idea, and when my eldest daughter got to primary mental health, she had to explain to the therapist what it was. Lost complete faith in the whole service. I was lucky because I worked in child health, so I knew what kind of things that we should be doing. Both of my daughters have recovered after 22 months for the youngest, and the eldest finished last year. They're both now driving. The youngest one is now going to university, and the eldest one is working for the university in Carmarthen. And, you know, I went on to do a master's, and my dissertation was on understanding the experience of young people with non-epileptic seizures. And I educated myself so that I can educate others, because parents, and I'm now training as a therapist, because parents should never ever have to be banging their heads on the door to get help.
It's really good to hear that positive thing at the end, despite all those troubles that you and your family had, isn't it? It sounds like a very positive.
There is there can be a positive ending.
Yeah. Which is perhaps a good place to stop. We're stopping at a positive ending. So thanks very much to Rob for his talk. Thanks very much to all our speakers, to Teja, to Margaret, to Mahinda, Russell, Beata and Galetta. Thanks so much to FND Hope, particularly Nikki, Teja, Bridget behind the scenes, and Eric Hughes, who worked very hard with technology. Other people on the research team, Catherine's been listening in, Marcus can't be here, but he's very co-led the project as well, and other researchers in Swansea. And thanks very much for you coming. So, diolch yn fawr. Feel free to have a bit more tea and coffee, some there to warm up a bit. But yeah, so thanks very much for coming. Really appreciate it. Thank you.